Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. Because I'm ensconced in non-fiction November, I'm going to save my reviews of all the non-fiction I've read until a sort of couple of wrap-up videos next week. So I don't really have anything to report on Friday reads this week. So instead, I thought I'd do another of my very, very occasional series of reading of my own flash fiction. So I've got a couple of stories for you today. The first is called Laundry Lists, and it was sort of inspired by sort of Hannah Arendt's writing on the Nazis, where she talked about the banality of evil, that a lot of the sort of functionaries and bureaucrats were able to sort of disengage a very limited sort of conscience and imagination to be able to perform their functions to execute the Holocaust. So this was inspired by that. He'd always had beautiful penmanship. His mother had inculcated it at the point of a scourge across his knuckles, reiterated by the monks who were his teachers at school, though they hit harder with their rattan reeds. They broke bone, yet still that nut could not be allowed to stem the flow of calligraphy, curlicues, flourishes and twirls, anything to banish the dread straight line of a letter. Though Bibles and prayer books were all mass printed these days, still he was demanded to learn the ancient skills of writing for parchment and scrolls. Fire and soul, that was the holy grail of scrivening, though to his mind it was unclear what promised land it begat. Perhaps his mother had been far-sighted when she had invested her meagre savings in a fountain pen all those years ago, for he had secured an administrative job in the civil service, a precious sinecure in these days of dearth and scarcity, an ornate script for sparse times. Yet he was no longer inking proclamations of the latest rationing ordinances. It was a different sort of quota he was fashioning in baroque swirls and convolutes, a singular winnowing at the point of his nib. It would have been faster to use a typewriter, but his superiors were concerned about traceability. Carbon papers and ribbons could be deciphered for their past tidings. He did wonder if this hinted that they knew their supremacy would come to an end and were already taking precautions to entomb their actions. He pressed the blotting paper, another potentially incriminating humble mainstay of his work, down onto the finished page. He examined it and saw his words reverse imprinted. Their beautiful cursive flow had become blotchy and tumescent as the paper had absorbed and diffused the pressure of his carefully calibrated ink. 2 copies of every list, one for operational use, one as a record until, presumably, the operation had been completed, when both would be set fire to. Immolation, the same fate as for those listed on the paper. Under torture, Senor Núñez begat Senora Ordóñez, begat Senorita Huyen to their inquisitors, and all their names were on the list in his elegantly swooping script. A single character, hard to read, might mean someone innocent was taken for extra-judicial sentencing, although to his mind, the children on the list must have been innocent at the very least. The Junta was acting judge, jury and executioner, but only he could play God. Through administering mercy, with a few missing strokes of his pen, he could perhaps save a name or two, leave them off the list altogether. His hand was cramping up. There were so many names to write these days. He paused to rest his aching wrist. He held up his half-inscribed sheet of paper. He'd always had beautiful penmanship. This second story is called Echoes, and I've always been sort of fascinated by trying to write sound, somehow sort of recreate the sort of sound in words, which is quite a hard thing to do. If ever you read any sort of music reviews of concerts and stuff, the journalists are pretty limited in their palette of how they can describe a guitar solo or a drum solo or something. So I was sort of casting about for an example of when sound creates something slightly more tangible, and I came up with this. This is called Echoes. The sure-handed technician swished the probe across my abdomen like an air hockey disc. She was sketching my child for me, drawing her from noiseless sound waves and silent rebounds, bouncing sonar off her budding tissue, having the echoes pulse back through the swell of me, and into the machine's imaging stick. Pixels of my little pixie, as her head is fully rendered, the outline of her arms expertly plotted by passage through the shallow fathoms. Even her fingers, floating like sargassum in the void, are charted through the sink and swim of the sonic undulations. The topography of my daughter, that slowly burgeoning coral reef cropping out from my amniotic seabed. The minute motions of her heart are as yet too tiny to be picked out in electrical motes, this being only the first draft for the overlay of more detailed pentimento compositions to come. But even without a monitor, I could see, feel and hear, most significantly, my own heartstrings go bing as her image became limned in light, emerging from the shadows of me. The technician squeezes some more jelly on my belly. It felt similar to when he used to pull out of me onto my stomach, terrified that we might launch new life. But her reproduction up there on screen suggests he got his timing wrong, that we were arrhythmic, out of step with one another. And when I relayed my suspicions of generation within me, he was off like a torpedo. There were no returning echoes from my plaintive pleas launched in the direction of his retreating form. Even though he was a complete dog, my entreaties appeared to be shrill beyond any audible frequency. But that's okay. I have someone really close now who is held wrapped by the softly lapping waves of my body and the song they make. Our call and response established here will be for all time. It was the same sonographer, but this time her piloting seemed less assured. There was a sense of choppy urgency to her sweeps over my distended stomach. And I scoped on the monitor that some of her pulses were not receiving the requisite echoes back. Her rudimentary tissues were too weak to bat them gently round. Her heart was now visible, but barely fluttering. They took me from lying prone under the ultrasound and folded me in half onto a seat in front of a consultant. He was speaking to me, but I couldn't hear his words. Wrong frequency for my brain to hold, I guess. A siren only I could hear was reverberating in my head. They depth charged her with medical payloads, and when those didn't find their target, they brought in an abominable bombardier with a suction duct to scuttle her little half-built vessel while she was still in harbour. And every day now, I rub my hand over my belly, the trenches and the depressions, yet the seabed there is still. No echoes ever return to me. Okay, so those are the two stories for this week. Thank you, BookTube, and next week I shall be back with at least 2 videos on non-fiction November. Till then, thanks.